Roses are my favourite garden plant. I use them in my designs almost with every garden I do, and I love growing them in my own garden. My garden has pretty poor soil for roses. It's limestone, so it's about pH 8, it's very thin, it's very poor. We get little rain here because we're in the East Midlands, and so I have to choose very good doers. I have to have roses that will look good with minimal input. I don't want to spray them, I don't want to add artificial nitrogen and things like that. I just want to plant them, mulch them and let them do their thing. And so I've chosen my top roses that do well for me here, that I use a lot in gardens. I suppose I have to start with shrub roses first off. And the English roses, which were bred by David Austin, my uncle, are obviously ones that are close to my heart. I have Constance Spry, which was the first rose that he bred of the English roses that won lots of awards. And he loved the old-fashioned rose look. And that was at a time when hybrid teas were very, very popular. And so he was really championing the old-fashioned rose. But he wanted to produce roses that had lovely old-fashioned blooms, had lots of scent, and that repeat flowered. Now, Constance Spry is fabulous, but it didn't have that elusive repeat flowering capacity. But it's still a great rose, and I've got one because my mother chucked it out. It didn't do well for her. I think she had it in a poor spot, and so she gave it to me, and I have it here and I love it. I don't spray it or anything, but I just enjoy it. But lots of clients want repeat flowering roses, and David used to get quite annoyed in a way, saying that no one expects a shrub to repeat flower. You don't expect a viburnum or a rhododendron or anything to repeat flower, so why should a rose? But actually he did it. He has produced many brilliant repeat flowering roses, and of his, the one that is my favourite repeat flower is James L. Austin. I love the deep crimson flower, and I planted this just at the end of the winter, and I was doing a video for showing how to beat rose replant disease, and I planted this lovely James L. Austin, and now it's so exciting to see it coming into bloom now. And I think roses take a good 2 years to establish and do really well, especially here, but even now it's looking pretty good. But I think next year and the year after it will just go on getting better and better. Another shrub rose that I really love, because I love stripes and checks, but you get stripes in roses, is Ferdinand Pichard. And I think that's a wonderful shrub rose. It's not one of David's. It repeat flowers, and it's got beautiful stripy roses that start off pink and crimson and go to white and crimson. And here it does so well, and it's planted in poor soil, and it's just fabulous, and it's such a showstopper. Another shrub rose that I use a lot is Sally Holmes, and that is a white shrub rose, and white is a very useful characteristic because we often do white gardens or white and blue gardens or white and pink, and Sally Holmes is a very sturdy disease resistant rose, and I grow it in against a north facing wall, and I think the light on a north facing wall is lovely. They don't burn out so much as in bright sunshine. So I think you really appreciate the colour white on a north facing wall. Obviously, if a rose isn't getting heaps of sun, it won't perhaps produce as many flowers on a shady wall, but those that it does produce are fabulous. So I often try and use Sally Holmes on many gardens, and if you've got a gardener that's not that experienced, they will still perform to perfection. On my taller north wall, I've got Madame Alfred Carrier, which is a wonderful old-fashioned repeat flowering scented white shrub which grows outside my bedroom window, and I love the fragrance, and that's an amazing rose for a north wall. Then another rose that does so well in poor conditions is Pearl Drift, another white. It sort of starts off slightly blush pink and then it goes to a paler white, and it has quite a shiny foliage, which I don't like so much. I prefer matter foliage, but overall it performs brilliantly. It dies quite gracefully, it stands up to storms and bad weather well, so that is a really good doer that I love. Another amazing rose that I don't know why more people don't grow is the Bengal Beauty, and this is a bright red single rose, and I got it from Nigel Slater's garden, the English cook, and I was entranced for this rose because I was recording with him and it was something like February, And then I discovered there was this brilliant red rose that flowered pretty much 12 months a year. It's extraordinary. And so I took cuttings of that and I now grow that rose. And I don't know why it's not better known, because I don't know of any rose that will flower as often as that. Now, my ones are now quite low. They're probably about 3 foot high, because they were 5 foot high and I radically cut them down late this winter. And so they are shorter and they haven't got so many flowers, because the more they grow, the more flowers they produce. But they will come into their own shortly. But it's a rose I'm really glad I've got, and I hope will have forever. You also get the ground cover roses. There's lots of those very modern ones. And there's an old-fashioned one which I like particularly, which is Rawbridger. And that's got lovely peony-like type buds. And again, I took that from a cutting. I'd put it in a client's garden and I didn't have it, so she kindly let me have a cutting. And I won't just take one. Usually there's lots of growth, so I might take 5 or 6 cuttings, and then you're going to be sure to get 2, 3, 4 good plants from it. And that's single flowering again, but it's unsurpassable. I think you can grow it over low walls, on banks, situations like that. And the final shrub rose is Pomponella. And this is a lovely rose. Again, it looks very much like a peony, but it's much taller than Rawbridger. It goes to 4 foot high or so. It flowers continuously, and you have masses and masses of blooms. So this was bred by Corders, I think, a German rose breeder. And I've got this maybe only 6, 7 years ago, but I'm really glad I found it. And I think it's a fabulous rose that you rarely see, which surprises me. One shrub rose that I haven't got that I wanted to get for ages is Mutabilis, Rosa chinensis mutabilis. And I did order it, and then the rose arrived and it came out bright yellow or something. And it starts off with this lovely sort of coppery buds, and then it opens out sort of an apricot, and then it finally changes colour and ends up in the sort of deep crimson. And the great thing about Mutabilis is it just flowers non-stop all summer long. And we grew it on a garden under some cork oak trees, and it survives really well and flowers really well, even in those quite shady conditions. But I was visiting that garden yesterday, so I took some cuttings, I put them in, wrapped their stems into some kitchen towel that was very damp, put it in a plastic bag, kept it in a cool place, and I'll take cuttings of it today. And I think that will probably root in 6 or 8 weeks' time. You see, I've taken off the lower leaves. I'm going to take off another one, and I'm going to take it about that long, and I'm going to stick it in towards the edge of the pot. And in here, in this medium, in these pots, I've just got about 50% perlite, the white stuff, and 50% compost, and it's very moist, okay, pretty moist. So it's a free draining, what we call open compost. And when you take cuttings, it's important to remember, first of all, that you want healthy growth. You don't want to take it from a plant that's not doing well, because then obviously the cutting's not going to do well. And I usually, when I'm doing something, a different rose, I will actually take some shorter cuttings, some longer cuttings, and hedge my bets a bit. Here I forgot to take off the flowers. You don't want them to flower, so if you've got buds or flowers on any cuttings, you just remove them with your fingers, because you want the energy to go to the roots. I'm going to pull that one away there, and you've just got a little heel, so I'll try one with a heel. I don't usually use hormone rooting powder because it has a very short shelf life, but I just take more cuttings than I need, so I've got extra as an insurance. After just 7 weeks of being in moist compost in a cool, shady spot, the roots have developed beautifully. I've now separated each cutting and planted them on in various pot sizes, depending on how large their roots are. My favourite time to take rose cuttings is when I see them in someone's garden and I discover them and they say, oh, this is an amazing rose, it does X, Y, Z. And I saw a lovely climbing rose in John Kushner's garden, who was a Gardener's Question Time panellist with me for many years. Sadly, he's passed away now. But I remember in his garden, he had this wonderful pink climber, and he called it the calendar rose. He didn't think that was its real name, and I don't think it is. He didn't know its real name. So I took a cutting of it, then we did a few programmes, stayed in Ireland for a few days, kept it in a hotel, brought it back on a plane, and then took cuttings when I got home, and they rooted. And it's so lovely to have a memory of John now in my garden. I've never been able to find out the name of this rose, but it's spectacular. And so although no books that I've read tell you to take cuttings when they're in bloom, that is when I almost inevitably do it, because I seize the chance when I see them in flower. And I've never yet failed, I have to say. So far, it's always worked. So deadheading is one of the pleasanter gardening jobs, I think, because you can do it in the evening very relaxed and gently. And I think the thing to remember is that when you're deadheading, to start with, when you've got a group of roses, a bunch of roses, you will have one or two individual roses that will go off quicker than the others. So I literally just pinch those out, either with secateurs or fingernails, so you have the whole truss still looks good. And then when the whole truss has died, then you want to cut it off much further down the stem, because if you just cut it off just below the top of the truss, then you're going to have a very weak point where the rose will reflower from. Okay, so if you go further down, you have a thicker stem, so you have a sturdier rose. So don't be mean, go right back down and cut it off further back than perhaps just behind the dead rose. Of course, not all roses repeat. Some roses might produce hips in the autumn, in which case you don't deadhead, and you want to see the lovely big crimson hips in the autumn and winter for the birds. But otherwise, just do that because they look neater, they look better, and it's a nice thing to do. I don't always have time to deadhead everything, but when I do, I love doing it, and I'm glad I've done it. So coming on from the shrub roses, we go to the climbing roses. And the rose that I've got growing up my obelisks, which I really love, is Jacques Cartier. And this is a repeat flowering pink rose. It flowers all summer long. And I grow it with the clematis. And the clematis I grow it with is Clematis crossgerandii. And again, that's the longest flowering clematis that I know. And I love the combination of the pale pink and the blue, and it's very easy to prune. You just cut, because it's a herbaceous clematis, you just cut it down to about 9 inches in the autumn, and then it zooms back to life, and it's already at the top of the pillars now in June. And so I think that's a lovely rose, it can be a climber, Jacques Cartier, or it can be a shrub rose, but I use it as a climber. And that is the same with many English shrub roses. If you put them against a wall, they will be a short climber. And the advantages of that is that often many traditional climbing roses just have the roses at the tops, and they have what is known as bare bottoms. But when you plant an English rose as a climber against a wall, you have much more foliage and flowers right down to the ground. Now, probably my favourite climber in my garden is actually a unique repeat flowering rambler, and that is Phyllis Blyde. And that's got this lovely sort of pinky apricot tones to it. It goes on and on and on, and it doesn't get too massive. And it's on a north wall, so even without masses of sunshine, it performs probably the best of any climber I know. So Phyllis Blyde is a hot favourite for me, and I use it on a lot of jobs because it tolerates my conditions, it always performs, and it's very disease free. So when you're training climbers against a wall, I think people get quite unsure as to what system to use. I mean, the system I use is often just parallel wires about a foot or so apart with vine eyes at either end, so you can have a nice parallel system of wires, and then you just tie the roses onto that. Now, my mother used to just get chicken wire, and she just used to pin chicken wire to the wall, and her house had stone walls. And actually, for the first few weeks you noticed it, but soon it sort of rusted and faded and you didn't notice it, and it was covered with the growth of the rose. And the reason she liked it is because, as many people do when they're training roses, they like to actually have a stem and let it go up, and then they like to pull it down. So you've actually got the branch is actually arching round. So you'll have several arches up and over like that on both sides. And that's because you're pulling all the hormone down to the tips. And so then you'll get lots of flowers coming all the way along the branch. Whereas if you grow them straight up, then often you can get the flowers just at the tips. Most rambling roses, as opposed to climbers, will only flower once a year. They'll flower, have a lovely bloom in the early summer or around June, July time, whereas climbers tend to be repeat flowering or single time flowering. But it's very unusual for a rambler to be repeat flowering. But the one that I grow, and I grow on the edge of my woodland, is Plan de Grace. And this was a present to me from Arabella Lennox Boyd when I went to stay with her. And she goes and collects lots of plants from the wild, from seed and things like that. And she had grown this on and she gave me it. And it's wonderful on the edge of my woodland, tolerating competition from trees in terms of light and moisture, but it still is very strong, and it grows right up into the trees, and it must be growing 3-4 meters high now and spreading almost the same distance. And I think it's really nice, and I think that's a lovely way if you want to liven up your edge of your woodland and you're trying to go from an orchard to a wood or a lawn to a wood. That's a lovely edge of wood shrub to grow, a lovely plant to grow, and I'm really pleased with that. And when you get really big old stems, I'll just come in and chop out the one really dead old, the really thick stems, and then it will send up younger stems that will be much more vigorous. And I'll probably do that sort of August, September time, something like that. And they're extraordinary plants, and they do so well. I mean, things like Kifskate is really well known, and that is a massive one that grows for miles, and there are lots of ramblers like that that really are very vigorous and just go into trees and spread for miles and miles and miles almost. An exciting new range of roses which I planted a couple of years ago when they just came out, and these are the Timeless series of roses, and they were bred by Whartons. And there's 4 of them. There's Timeless Cream, Timeless Purple, Timeless Pink, and Timeless Charisma. And they are bred as cut flower roses, which is why I've got them in my vegetable garden, because I like my cutting flowers in amongst my vegetables. And I think roses next to rhubarb, next to artichokes, next to potatoes look fantastic. And I don't cut huge amounts of flowers for the house. I just don't have the time, but I like to have the odd bunch, and I think this is a brilliant way to do it because it livens up the veg, and the veg almost complements the roses in my book. And Whartons have bred these, and I think the reason they are different is A, they produce flowers on and on and on throughout the growing season. B, they've got nice long stems, which is nice when you want to cut them. They have scent, and they really stand up to the weather. We've had incredible storms, and these roses still look amazingly good. And when you're cutting a rose for the house, you will cut it just above. You cut the stem to the length that you want it, and you will then cut it just above a leaf node. So if you were taking it for a cutting, I'd take it just below a leaf node, but for a cut flower, you do it like that. And then you'll take off the lower leaves, and then you'll put it in water. And these are bred to last well in water, and these will last for about 2 weeks. So I think they're a fabulous addition to my garden. And finally, a group of roses that I think are quite neglected are standard roses. And this is when you have a stem and you have the rose grafted onto the top. And you can have half standards, so they're about that high, or you can have taller standards, so they're grafted at that high. And I've used them in my wall garden because I want a bit of height. I don't want massively big buxom roses as bushes, but I want the height. So by planting a standard, I've got exactly that. Now I've chosen Munstead Wood, which I think is a lovely, really deep maroony colour. And I love that. It is slightly disease prone, I must say. And the other problem you must realise when you plant standard roses is you will get where it's grafted at the bottom, as you often roses are grafted at the bottom if you haven't taken them from cuttings, and it will also be grafted at the top. So you've got potential for 2 lots of places for suckering, at the bottom and then also at the top where it's grafted. So you just need to keep an eye on that and make sure that you quickly clip off the growth from the suckers, so that it's not making the rose check its growth, the rose that you want, the cultivated rose. Now, if you can have weeping standards, I haven't, my Monkshood wood are just ordinary standards, but you can have weeping standards and then they sort of droop down. And people like those, and they often put them on those sort of rose domes, and so you have them weeping down over the rose domes and you pull them down over those. But mine are just ordinary standard roses that I sort of roughly clip and shape as they go on. But they're a lovely way to add a bit of eye level height without having a mass of shrub rose in the ward, if perhaps you haven't got much space or whatever. So I think that roses are very personal. Different people like very different roses, very different styles. But what I think, that whatever styles of roses you like, they do fit into almost any type of garden. They must be the most versatile plant, which is why I think roses have been the most popular plant, the nation's favourite, for hundreds of years. And I think they'll never, ever go out of fashion. And you can't get better than that.